Hey guys, my name is Jeremy Hare, History of Jonathan Edwards 435, spring of 2017. Pretty excited about this project. This is actually going to be my last project as an undergraduate student at Liberty University. I have thoroughly enjoyed my experience, not only from the school but the professors. It just gives me overwhelming joy, to be able to say I'm a graduate of Liberty University. Today we're going to be talking about, in my last research project, the impact Jonathan Edwards had and has on John Piper. Many people don't know John Piper, but he is a pastor, he's a theologian, he's a writer, he's a father, he's a grandfather, and the list goes on. He's influenced millions of people, not just from laymen to other pastors and theologians, sort of like Edwards. Give you a little bit of background real quick on John Piper for those that do not know him. This information comes from desiringgod.org, which John Piper is the founder of. There's a lot of information there, a lot of good information for those that want to do further research on Piper. John Piper was born on January the 11th, 1946 in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Not long after his birth, his family, Bill, which is his father, which was an evangelist, and his mother, Ruth, relocated to Greenville, South Carolina, and that is where John Piper grew up. Upon graduation from high school, Piper ended up moving to and going to getting his undergraduate work completed at Wheaton College from 1964 through 1968. At Wheaton, Piper majored in literature, minored in philosophy. Upon completion of his undergraduate work in 1968, he actually married Noelle, and she became to have that same relationship that Sarah Edwards had on Jonathan Edwards. She was a large figure in his life, as well as many pastors have experienced. There's no great pastor without a great wife. It's the same thing with John Piper. Upon completion of his undergrad and getting married in 68, he ended up attending Fuller Seminary from 1968 to 1971, where he attained his Master's of Divinity. Upon completion of that, he decided to go a little bit further, get his PhD in New Testament studies from Munich in Germany. It was actually in West Germany, which is phenomenal feat in itself. Getting your PhD is a large enough task, but then when you have to learn another language so you can get your PhDs is a tough experience. But what this shows about Piper is that he knew what his calling was, just like Edwards. He was intellectually, he had all the tools, but as many know, that intellect does not call to be a great pastor, does not call to be a great theologian. It takes submitting to the Father for that to take place. And that's what Piper has done for so many years, is what we've seen that Jonathan Edwards done throughout his life. And like I say, just to give you a quick background of Edwards, a little bit about his life, the information comes from Jonathan Edwards Center at Yale University. He was born, that would be Edwards, October the 5th, 1703 in East Windsor, Connecticut. Edwards' childhood was quite a bit different than Piper. Piper, went through all the grades and was pretty much a normal child. Upon completion high school, that's when he went to get his undergraduate work completed. Edwards, on the other hand, attended Yale University at the age of 13, which is a phenomenal task in itself. He done his undergraduate work from 1716 through 1720. Upon completion of an undergraduate, he rolled straight into his graduate work from 1721 to 1722. The phenomenal part about this is to get in your undergraduate work and doing any kind of graduate work in the 1700s is phenomenal. That just shows that the drive that Edwards had, but also the intellect to be able to do that. You can have all the drive in the world, but if you don't have the tools up top, then it ain't going to happen. But Edwards had it, and that was a gift. He would be the first one to admit that everything that he had was a gift from the Lord. In 1727, Edwards married Sarah Pierpont, which I said was a close correlation to Noelle, the one that married John Piper. They both of these men, they had great women standing behind them, and that's what fueled a lot of their life and their ministry. John Piper, actually, where we learned of Jonathan Edwards was actually when he was in West Germany. Well, when he was actually in seminary, he had a professor that told him one day, he said, "Look, John," he said, "for you to grow, you need to pick one theologian, and you need to study him and know him well. John Piper said, well, all right, sounds legit. So he decided that he done a little bit of research, not much, and he landed on Jonathan Edwards. And at the time that he landed on him, the only thing that he knew is like what most Americans and most people in the world know, is that he was the preacher of sinners in the hand of an angry God. That's all he knew. But the more he dug into Jonathan Edwards, the more he realized that he was so deep and so rich. The first encounter with Edwards was when he read an essay on the Trinity. Besides, and these are the words of John Piper. I can't put it any better than what Piper himself said. He said, besides helping me to conceptualize, at least in part, the affirmation that God is three in one, this essay taught me something about mystery and Scripture. You know, John Piper's an intelligent young man, but what he said was here is that reading the work of Edwards, he conceptualized at least in part. You know, relating back to the Scriptures where Peter said that, you know, not everybody quite understands the words of Paul. Basically what that's saying is that these guys are on a different level than most people, and John Piper is somewhat admitting that here. He said, you know, I understood as much as I knew to understand. He said, but, you know, Edwards was far above me. But he was just saying how much this treatise had affected him in the understanding of the Trinity. But it didn't stop there. I mean, after he finished this treaty on the Trinity, the next work that John Piper read while he was still in seminary was Freedom of the Will. And this one in particular probably had the biggest impact on Piper's life and his theological foundation. I mean, you can take it from the title, Freedom of the Will, and these are the words again of Piper. I found it totally compelling, philosophically, and in perfect harmony with the emerging biblical theology. St. Paul and Jonathan Edwards conspire me to demolish my previous notions about freedom. The book was a defense of Calvinistic divinity. You see, Edwards, the great thing about him is you can study his theology and it lines up pretty spot on with the Scriptures. And that's what Piper admired so much about Jonathan Edwards, is that, you know, you can read a lot of guys and they kind of take a little bit of Scripture and get their opinion and put in there, and that's what they form their theological foundation with. But what Piper really appreciated about Jonathan Edwards is that he took his, and when he matched it up with the Scriptures, it aligned. But he's not talking about some of the simpler principles of Christianity. He's talking about some of the more fundamental things that a lot of people still in 2017 debate. Freedom of the will, the Trinity. These are not easy topics. And as like Piper said, he said he didn't quite understand all of them, but it helped to put some of his thoughts together and to help form a theology for him. This right here is similar, and I can speak in the same sense of me being in college for the last few years and studying under guys like Tim Keller and J.D. Greer that theologically are a little more sound than I am. But these guys, when you study their theology and then I study Edwards, I say, well, you know, that's where they got it from. So a majority of theologians, they get their theology from Jonathan Edwards. The same thing with John Piper. And it's not just, you know, some of the smaller principles. I mean, it's some of the big, true, hot topics. The Trinity, freedom of the will. But, you know, and it didn't end there. In a capsule, this is what John Piper sums up after reading this last book. He said, in a capsule, the book argues that God's moral government over mankind, his treating them as moral agents, making them the object of his commands and counsels, cause and warning, is not inconsistent with a determining disposal of all events of every kind throughout the universe. In his providence, either by positive efficiency or permission, there is no such freedom of the will in the Arminian sense. So that's what John Piper got from it. And, you know, pretty much probably what Edwards had in mind when he wrote it is that he wanted to make it line up biblically. That way nobody could dispute it. But also in the same sense was to fight Arminianism. So that's what he done, and he done it very effectively. And what this ended up doing for Piper's life is it constructed for him a more Calvinistic background. Ask anybody today what they identify John Piper as, and they would say like a hyper-Calvinistic, which is like a new Calvinism. Even though he's like Edwards, he don't appreciate that term. he is along those lines. After he read that last book, he concluded with this after he read The Nature of True Virtue. He said, when I finished that book, I not only had a deep longing to be a good man, but also wrote a poem called Georgia Woods, because nothing looked the same when I put this book down. So you can see right here, we just looked over 3 treatises right now that John Piper has read of Jonathan Edwards, and each of the 3 has drastically changed his life. From the freedom of the will to the way he views the world. And that's the thing about, the self-reflection that Edwards really hones in on, especially throughout his diary. When you look back on your days and see the things that you've done, and you start to look around and you do reanalyze things, and that's what Piper's done. And the biggest thing that I think that Piper has got from Jonathan Edwards is his idea of glory. And when I was taking notes and trying to get all this put together, that was the biggest thing that stood out to me. And I'll read you the words of Edwards. God created the world to spread out the fullness of His glory for His people to know and praise and enjoy. That's the words of Jonathan Edwards. Now later on, in Tony Ricci's Why Do I Exist?, he wrote about what John Piper's theology was summed up as. And listen to these words. God's purpose in creation, therefore, was to fill the earth with His own glory. A little bit different verbiage in there, but the gist of it was the same. God created the world to glorify Him, and He uses humanity to do that. And that was the gist of Jonathan Edwards, and that's the gist of John Piper. He's wrote many books, and Desiring God is probably John Piper's biggest book that he's read. I think Piper has wrote over 50 books, but his biggest was Desiring God. I think it was in 1986. And if you go through and put all the main themes together, the main themes are Jonathan Edwards' themes. That's the gist of it. Another similarity and another impact that Edwards has had on Piper is that of orderly worship. That is something that in the modern sense is the charismatic movement is today would have been like the awakening times when Jonathan Edwards was around. People feel like that things get kind of out of hand, and Jonathan Edwards, he wrote treatises back when these awakenings were taking place to kind of to shun some of these actions and to say, hey, this is true, this is not true. But John Piper has done the same thing. In an article, he was addressing the strange fire and charismatic chaos. And what Piper's doing here is he's saying that, and I'll read you the exact words of Piper. In his article, he speaks of many things that are some people as moves of God, and to Piper, they are chaotic and non-God-centered. So what he's saying is that, and it's the same thing that Edwards is saying, in these chaotic services where there's, a little bit over an abundance, he said that is chaotic and non-God-centered. J.I. Packer says the same thing. He said the old theology was God-centered. He said, but the new man in the new theology is man-centered. And that's what Piper and that's what he got from Edwards is saying. Is that when you have these chaotic services and these people exalting themselves, he's basically saying that's a man-centered theology and not God-centered. He was all for the Spirit of God and the movement of God, and he wanted that to take place. But he wanted it to be biblical, not to be chaotic. And that was probably the biggest thing that he got from Edwards was not only to glorify God, but, orderly worship. And he also, another principle, and this is my concluding point of the impact that Edwards had on Piper, and is that of work. Let me read you a quote from Vance Christie. When I look at Calvin and Edwards, this is John Piper saying, when I look at Calvin, that'd be John Calvin, and Jonathan Edwards and their output, it is hard to me to feel sorry for myself in my few burdens. These brothers inspire me to break out of mediocre plodding. So Piper has allowed following the pattern of work as well as Edwards and Calvin. So what Piper is saying, he was amazed by the amount of work that that Jonathan Edwards and John Calvin had put out, and he followed that same trend. You know, he has pastored a church. He pastored at Bethlehem Baptist in Minnesota for some 30 years. But in the process, you know, he's wrote numerous treaties, numerous articles, spoke in numerous conferences, and he's done so while being a pastor. His output is phenomenal as well, just like Edwards. They all feel like that their main purpose is to glorify God, and the way that they can do that is through their ministry. You know, throughout John Piper's ministry, he's preached between him and some of the others at his conferences that he holds each year. Some 13 sermons on Jonathan Edwards. So, I mean, Jonathan Edwards' impact on John Piper is something that you can speak about for days. From the freedom of the will, from the glory of God, from work to orderly worship. He's impacted him so much that once you read Piper, and if you know anything about Jonathan Edwards, you say, that's a direct correlation right there. He got that directly from Jonathan Edwards. And all of this took place while John Piper was in college. He started learning and started studying him. So it's a good thing. Now that we're in college, all of us are in college, this gives us an opportunity to study and to broaden our theological basis. It's been a joy, guys, and I love each and every one of you. I'll definitely be praying about you as you finish up this semester. Love you guys.